My Death Guard army is moving kinda slowly. So, let's go ahead and fix that by painting one of my favorite monsters in all of 40k, the Great Unclean One. If you've never heard of one of these guys before, then let me explain. Demons of the Plague God Nurgle, Great Unclean Ones invade reality to spread pestilence and disease where they travel. They're massive, grotesque mountains of rotting flesh, swarming with clouds of flies and crawling with maggots. The best part is they're usually pretty jovial fellows. Being demons of Nurgle, they can't really feel pain or despair. Or much, really. Yeah, being a follower of Nurgle kind of sucks, like, really hard. There is one little problem, though. I, kind of really don't like the official model very much. At all. You look at the art of these things, and there's this aura of despair, dread. They look like they're having a great time, but they're kind of menacing about it. Then you look at the newest sculpt, and he's just kind of like, his face is just so goofy looking, man. I can't take him seriously. Well, that's no matter. I went ahead and found this awesome proxy model on Etsy. This here is the Avatar of Necrosis, available in Parasite Collectibles Welcome Pack on my mini factory. He is just about the perfect size to act as a replacement model, and honestly, I think he looks way better. He's just about everything I'd want from a Great Unclean One, and honestly, he looks kind of similar to that fan art of Nurgle himself you see floating around every once in a while. Wait a minute. Fan art? No, there's no way. Hang on. That can't be right. I must have misread. Oh. Would you look at that? Learn something new every day, I guess. A common complaint I hear is that painting a model this big at all quickly to any kind of high quality is frankly unattainable. But I just don't think that's true. So today, I want to see if I can get this big boy painted with nothing more than a regular old paintbrush and some grit. First things first, let's go ahead and get him on a temporary base. The Great Unclean One comes with a frankly massive 130mm base, which honestly kind of makes painting him pretty hard. He does admittedly seem a little wobbly, but I'm sure it'll be fine. So our first real step is going to be to prime our model. For that, I'm going to be using Vallejo Black through my airbrush. Okay, so I know this looks bad, but let me explain. In all seriousness, I'm just doing this so that I don't need to go out and buy a brand new can of spray primer. Whatever you've got lying around, whether it be a rattle can or a brush-on primer, is going to make zero difference in the end product compared to what I'm using here. Once that dried, I went ahead and sprayed everything down with olive green. If you're not using an airbrush to prime, I would entirely skip priming in black and just skip to priming him straight in green. Here, I'm doing my absolute best to cover up every single inch of that black primer because I want this to be as truly green as possible. And to punish me for my cheapness, God has cast my Great Unclean off his painting handle, breaking the chains on his flail. Cool. Well, let's go ahead and fix this by using a technique I was going to use later on anyways. To help set the stage for large-scale rust, we're going to be using some super glue and baking soda. This stuff is super easy to do. Just put a dot of super glue down, sprinkle on some baking soda, and that's it. The added bonus to doing this on the seam where it broke is that the baking soda dries rock solid with a coat of super glue, meaning the joint is, hypothetically, even stronger than it was before when it was just printed. Because he's a Death Guard model, I went pretty heavy with this effect, but you could also go much lighter, or even heavier. I'm not your mom. From here on, we're going to be using some pretty simple techniques to build up depth of color quickly that anybody can do. So let's go ahead and do some dry brushing to bring out some of the skin texture here. I first started with a layer of golden olive, going very heavy on all of his fat folds and skin texture. One of the best ways to make a model this large and naturally shaped look good is by focusing on texture and dynamic contrast. I'm not going to go crazy here and work to a display level, but I do want to set up some primitive lighting, so I make sure to go heavier on the right side of his body, leaving his left side just a bit darker, particularly in areas like under his arm and neck. I then do another layer of dry brushing, mixing some warm yellow in equal parts with my golden olive, covering less of the bright parts with this layer. Finally, I throw some ivory into the mix and do one final pass, covering even less than last time. Now let's go ahead and get those shadows nice and grungy, while also helping to blend our highlights together some. A great way to make your shadows more interesting is to not just take your base color and add black to it, making it darker, sure, but also desaturating it. Instead, adding a darker but complementary color can really help make your model pop. For this, I'm going to use purple, as that's the color skin naturally turns when it starts to rot. Don't ask how I know that. I mixed some Magos purple contrast together with Agrax Earthshade in just about even parts and water that mix down about evenly. I'm not measuring anything precisely here, just moving quick and slapping paint down. This mix goes over all of the green areas. This will take a little bit to dry, so come back in about 20 minutes or so and check on it. Now we're going to go ahead and go back to the same highlight dry brushing we did before. Golden olive, a mix with warm yellow. Then, this time instead of ivory, we're going to use white. This will help desaturate our highlights and make the skin look just a little bit more sickly. Then I do one more final highlight, just adding in a bit more white. Honestly, painting like this, where you highlight, bring it back down with a wash, then re-highlight, may seem counterintuitive. But I've personally found that this is a very fast, efficient way to get a lot of contrast and depth to your model for very little effort. Now I want to get some of those deeper shadows even darker. For this, I'm going to mix together some Volupus pink, Blood Angels red, and Agrax Earthshade to get a kind of fleshy, bloody color. This got thinned heavily so that we make it into a glaze. This means we need like 3 to 4 parts water to paint. If you've never used one, a glaze is a thin layer of paint applied over an area to tint colors subtly. This helps us to have absolute control over how dark our shadows will be without relying on the unruliness of a wash. We also don't want to go straight to the model with this mix. Instead, we want to dampen a napkin just a bit with water, then roll the excess paint out of our brush onto that. This helps keep our paint from pooling out onto the model, keeping that control we're looking for. I did a few passes of this glaze, focusing mostly on the underside of the model and on the deepest folds like the ones on his stomach. He is looking pretty good so far, but being a mostly monocolor model, we do need to take a few liberties to keep things looking interesting. As just about nobody watching this knows, I've been a diabetic since I was 9 months old. And if you didn't know, diabetics are super prone to something called neuropathy, which, if left untreated, can eventually lead to necrosis in the limbs, which I just thought, as a kid, was kinda inevitable. So, why not add some childhood trauma to this guy? I first started this by glazing some more Magos and Agrax onto the limbs, but this just wasn't dark enough. So I went ahead and added a little bit of black Templar to this mix, and it worked much better. Admittedly, in some spots I did kind of use this as more of a wash instead of a glaze, but honestly, it worked out well enough, so who cares? This is solid so far, but does need to be a bit brighter to be actually legible on a table. So I mixed some purple into my olive green base color and started layering. I then added some ivory and did 2 progressively brighter layers. While I'm at it, let's also go ahead and get some brighter, more controlled highlights on the green skin. I add some ivory into my golden olive and add a few sparing dots and scratches to the brightest points. I then did one final pass, adding a bit more ivory in before moving on. Gross flesh time. To start things off, I'm going to go ahead and mix together some shadow flesh and magenta and start base coating the neck hole. Here on the neck is a good example of why painting monsters can be kinda tricky. There's no clear divide between where the mouth starts and the neck ends. The gums and teeth just kinda grow out of the green skin with no dividing line. So, all I'm doing here is slapping down some of my base coat, rinsing my brush out quickly, then using some of that leftover moisture to feather out my paint. This doesn't need to be clean. In fact, having some rough, splotchy coverage can help sell this as diseased skin even better. This is definitely one of those moments where, if you've never tried this, stepping out of your comfort zone and trying something new can not only be really rewarding, but also look really good and be way easier than you imagined. I myself have not done a ton of feathering or wet blending. So, if I can do this, you absolutely can too. After the neck was painted, I also went ahead and base coated out his guts. I, admittedly did miss the giant gaping wound on his elbow, but, I'll come back and fix that later. Then, to get some nasty looking highlights, I mixed in some olive flesh to my flesh mix and started hitting the brighter bits. I'm going to be going a bit overly bright right now, as later it's going to get toned way down. But right now, it is incredibly important that we make sure all of our volumes are clearly defined, especially on something so tangled and nasty as the guts. These can very quickly become random blobs of mass with no real defined shape. So I'm sort of drawing edges on these things as I work. I did about 2 more brighter passes and moved on. Before we finish off the gory flesh, I'm going to go ahead and work on the horns. These got base coated with dark umber, and as I'm base coating these, I'm being very careful not to get any brown on the already painted skin, and especially not on the neck. Alright, his actual mouth. I guess I should probably go ahead and do that now. I just mixed some more shadow flesh with magenta, then added some pale pink to make some quick, nasty highlights. Easy. To highlight the horns, I'm going to keep things simple. I just did more dry brushing. I started with Mournfang brown to introduce some warm tones. As I move up in brightness, I want to be covering less of the base of the horns, focusing more on the tips. Then I used some dark sun yellow before finishing it off with pure ivory on the very brightest edges and points. Now let's go ahead and work on the leather. I think keeping this subdued will help the overall model feel a bit more tied together. Because the horns are also brown, however, I want to mix things up just a little bit. Something I like doing when I have 2 similar colors on a model is to mix up the tones just slightly. So while I base coated this in the same color, dark umber, I'm going to start highlighting it with bright umber. Just like on the rest of the model, the key to making this look good on such a large surface is to focus on the texture of it. As I highlight this, I'm making a ton of little scratchy crisscrossing lines to help his loincloth look extra worn and gross. I then mixed in some ivory and gave it a few more brighter passes. The belts had a similar process done, except I used Mournfang instead of light umber. I want to take a second to emphasize a point here. Even though these 3 surfaces, the horns, loincloth, and belt, are all painted with the same 4 or 5 paints, they all look distinct enough. You don't need 500 different pre-mixed paints to make something look good. You just have to apply a few of them creatively. Now let's go ahead and tone down those wounds and make them nasty. I mixed together some more Volupus pink and Blood Angels red, thinned them down, and washed all of the exposed flesh. I also put an extra layer of pure, thinned Blood Angels red all over the guts and elbow tongue to help differentiate them from the neck mouth. Once that dried, I went back to re-highlight these sections. These mixes were mostly the same as the first time, except this time I added some pale pink onto the layers of my neck mouth to try and make them look a bit more distinct from the gory entrails. To help accentuate the gore, I thinned some blood for the blood god down and slapped it all over the guts. If you've never used this stuff, it's frankly amazing. It's a kind of gel-like paint which helps give your gore a bit more mass instead of staying super thin like a traditional paint. As I apply it, I'm focusing mostly on the recesses between the intestines and the deeper gashes on the elbow, while still allowing some of the paint to get on the raised parts. As well, I applied some paint to the edges of these areas and feathered it out like I did on the pink flesh on the gums of the neck. What a strange sentence. Just about done with the model itself, but we do still need to finish the metals. Before I do that though, I dry brushed the feet of the little cage demon on the Unclean one's shoulder. This doesn't need to be complex, it's just a little cursory detail for flavor. The metallics are also going to be left pretty simple. I'm going to be using 2 different paints here, bronze and dark silver. The lash and cage got some silver, while the rest of the metals are all based in bronze. Then I went ahead and gave them a wash with Agrax, applying it straight out of the pot for maximum staining. Once the wash dried, I tore off a chunk of sponge from a sponge brush, making sure the edge was nice and varied by plucking pieces off of it and was ready to highlight. To start, take your base color and thin it out just a bit more than equally with water. Tap your sponge into your paint, then dab the excess off onto a napkin until you're leaving little dots behind instead of big old puddles. Then start hitting the places that would naturally accumulate wear and tear. Blade edges, corners, anything raised, etc., etc. Don't go too heavy with this step, as a great unclean one should be swinging around absolutely hideous, disgusting weapons. We don't want this to start looking too clean, which is why we applied the wash so heavily in the first place. After that's done, we want to take a brighter version of our base coats, in this case, bright silver and rich gold, and we're going to repeat the exact same process. This time, however, you want to cover up much less of the highlights to make things stay nice and gross. For a final touch on the metallics, I'm breaking out the secret weapons: Dirty Downs, Rust, and Verdigris paints. This stuff is basically witchcraft in a bottle, and though it's a little pricey, it lasts a very long time. These are water-based paints which react in a crazy realistic way once they dry, but they do take a little finesse to apply properly. First, start by shaking the hell out of your bottle because it coagulates pretty heavily on the bottom. The first time I used this stuff, I genuinely thought it was one of those as seen on TV scam products that never work as well as they do in the ads, because all of the pigment was just stuck at the bottom of the bottle. Fun fact, there's actually a little mixing ball in these, so if you're shaking it and you don't hear it, keep shaking until you do. I also like to thin mine down with water just a little bit, as it helps make the effect more pronounced. I apply this stuff basically all over on a model like this, as it really should be nice and rusty. I do focus more heavily on the recesses, as that'll be where more water rests, causing extra oxidation in the metals. Once applied, if you don't like how the effect turned out, that's literally not even a concern. Because these paints are completely water soluble, you can just take a moist brush and rework the area until you're happy. This is also a great way to clean up messy edges or remove slight amounts of rust where you went just a little bit overboard. Although there's still a few touches left on the model, let's go ahead and get working on the base before we finish things off. I have a really cool idea for this base. I want my Great Unclean one to look like he's trudging through a desert that's slowly being transformed into a plague swamp. So I want to have a toxic green river flowing underneath his leg. To do this, I'm going to first need to build up my base with some corkboard. I tear off some varying size chunks and start gluing them together with gel superglue. In order to have the river flowing under him, I start building up rocks on the side of the bases, tapering up towards the center with a gap between them. It was around here that I removed my Great Unclean one from his temporary base to make sure his feet would fit on his new home. Once I was happy with the general shape, I marked out where I wanted him to stand with a Sharpie pen, then took my X-Acto knife and started carving away the edges. To get things looking natural, you want to make sure you don't have any clean, pronounced edges, as cork tends to make. Keep taking out chunks and carving things away until you're nice and happy with the overall look. Painting this base is going to be real easy, and I'm starting by applying some Vallejo Earth texture paste on all of the flat surfaces. I just take a brush and apply a ton of this stuff everywhere. I also make sure to blend in some of the carved edges into the flat areas with this paste to help further break up the transitional lines we'd get otherwise. While I waited for the texture paste to dry, I went back to the model. On some of the deeper shadows, I went ahead and mixed another very thin Blood Angel's Red glaze to make his skin look even more irritated and infected. I also added some of this to the bases of the horns on his back to try and sell the idea that they were bursting out of his skin. Once that dried, I went ahead and covered the base with dark umber, then dry brushed up with the same color mixes that we used on the loincloth, pushing my brightest highlight into just pure ivory. Now, I will confess, water effects are not something that I am super comfortable with, but I do have some experience in. Here, I'm using Vallejo water texture. This stuff is a water paint that works really easily straight out of the bottle. I do want to tint this stuff though, and I've got a kind of fun idea I want to try. Here, I've also got some fluorescent green ink. This stuff is great for two reasons. It's somewhat transparent, which will help sell this as dirty water, and it reacts under a black light, which will help give this base a sickly glow. I mixed just a few drops into some water texture, then applied it to my base with a pipette. While normal convention would tell you to mask off the edges and do a pour, I was kinda worried about the rough edges of the cork causing leaks, so I just did this instead. This does mean that, as the paint dries and shrinks, it won't be very deep, but honestly, I think this is a fine trade-off. To get things looking even more sickly and toxic, I want to add some nasty swirls of color. For that, I'll be using two different paints, a normal dark green ink and this disgusting slime effect from Army Painter, which, conveniently enough, is also fluorescent. I put a few drops of these on top of the river while it was still wet and swirled it around with a toothpick. I did this a couple of times until I was happy. And, I gotta say, this is disgusting in the best way possible. This stuff does take like a day to dry, so let's set it aside and finish off our monster. Eyes are 1, very hard to film yourself painting, and 2, very easy to explain, but very hard to execute. Take your finest, though not necessarily smallest, brush and some thin, off-white paint. Here, I'm using that very same Ivory from before. Don't worry about not getting this right on the first try, I rarely do either. Just make sure you're using thin paint that flows smoothly from your brush and try again. After that, you want to take some thin black paint and draw a very thin line going from the top of the center of the eyeball and down to the base of it. Once you're happy with the eye, carefully fix the surrounding areas and relayer where you need. For one final effect, I want to add some putrid vomit to the tongue. I first stippled on some more thin Ivory for where I want the vomit to be dribbling, then stipple on some Army Painter vomit effect paint. To give it some gross mass, I also mixed in some of my water effect paint and applied it to the very end of his tongue like it's dripping off. This didn't turn out exactly like I wanted, but honestly, it still looks really good, so I'm happy enough with it. Now that the base is dry, let's go ahead and stick him down. The only thing left to do is to base the rim with more of my black primer, and with that, he's finally done. Well, I hope you enjoyed seeing how I paint my bigger, monstrous models. With just a few simple techniques and knowledge of how to apply them, I have no doubt that you too can paint something to this quality, or frankly, even better. Oh, also, this base, fucking amazing. Zero complaints. Oh my god, I love this. Is this ever going to glow on an actual table? No, never in my lifetime. Do I want to do this to every single model I make from now on? Yes, absolutely. Well, that just about does it for today. I have a lot more models to paint before year's end. So, if you want to see any more of those, I don't know, subscribe or something. Bye.